Hello, everybody, and welcome to Project HR, a podcast dedicated to building better workplaces. Project HR is brought to you by Projections, an IRI company. IRI helps organizations navigate workplace challenges, improve employee engagement and productivity, manage labor relations, and implement effective communication strategies to achieve their goals. For more information, you can visit Projections online at projectionsinc.com. I am Jennifer Oraquad, Director of Business Development for IRI, and your host for today's episode of Project HR. I'd also like to thank Q Inc. for sponsoring this episode of Project HR. Q is your professional home for positive employee relations. When you join Q, you gain access to a tightly knit community of passionate people who are all committed to one another's success. For more information on upcoming conferences, events, and professional development opportunities, visit Q online at qinc.com. Now, for as long as companies have been online, cybersecurity has been a concern. But the last few years have shown a marked surge in malicious activity that demands corporate attention. Cyber attacks undermine the security of customer and employee data. They can introduce malware, including ransomware, which can cripple and disable any company of any size without warning. But what does this have to do with human resources? The time when cybersecurity was strictly an IT concern is long gone. And as my guest today has noted, cybersecurity is really a human issue at its core. I'm joined today by Marcy Klipfel, the Chief Engagement Officer at Businessolver, and we'll be talking about how human resources is a vital part of building a corporate culture that protects the company and every team member against cyber attacks. Marcy, thanks so much for joining me today on Project HR.
Yes, thank you for having me.
So in the introduction, I mentioned the recent surge in attacks. We've seen what happened with Colonial Pipeline and JBS, among many others, just this year. What's behind this surge?
Well, unfortunately, the hackers are getting smarter and better. And as they find weaknesses and exploit those, it just incentivizes them to continue to find different ways to get at, the most sensitive data that companies hold.
Yeah. So before we get too deep into this, I want to make sure I understand the kinds of cybercrime we're talking about here. Can we just touch on the different activities so we understand what it is that we're needing to be aware of?
Sure. It goes everywhere from phishing emails, which I'm sure lots of our listeners have experienced, where an email comes in and it masquerades as though it's from your CEO or another executive asking you to go buy Apple cards that they will reimburse you for later.
Mm-hmm.
And, those seem really obvious to us at this point, to as much advanced as just finding different weaknesses on your systems to be able to get into your systems and pull out very sensitive data. So it really runs the gamut in terms of ways that they can sort of exploit any weaknesses you may have from both a human standpoint as well as your system standpoint.
So what is it that I really need to be afraid of here? What are the consequences that my company could face if we had a data breach?
So obviously there's the big numbers that are splashed out in terms of the millions of dollars that are at risk by the hacking in or stealing the data and holding it hostage and asking for some sort of dollar amount in exchange. But I think the most risk you have is really your reputation, because these names, Equifax, those names in the news live on, and it can really damage your brand and the trust that clients have with your brand. And to me, that's the most damaging, because it's hard to even put a price tag on that.
Sure. And when I think of cybersecurity, I of course think of my IT team, and they're really still the primary gatekeepers for this effort, right? Correct? I mean, what's their role in keeping things secure?
So clearly IT plays this integral role, right? So they need to be the ones that are coming up with your risk framework and really have the compliance side and really do the due diligence when it comes to, from a software architecture standpoint, how secure, is the particular cyber or the security. You should have that expertise. When it comes, though, to your most risky element, it really is human and human error. And I truly believe, for the most part, employees don't wake up wanting to, subject your company to any sort of cyber attack.
Sure.
But the reality is humans make mistakes. And so when they are phished or they do hold responsibility of key data, you have to train them and make them aware of what could happen. And with that responsibility comes great accountability.
So with that in mind, how does HR come into this effort?
To me, HR is your central point of ensuring that this is part of your foundation, part of your culture, that you drive a culture of protecting the most important data that you have, which is holding client data, employee data. For us, certainly, we do house the most important data
Hmm.
that a company holds in terms of all the employee records, health records, and so you have to instill that from the day one of people joining your organization and continue to remind them that this is who we are in terms of taking responsibility and having that accountability and being really vigilant
Hmm.
about protecting our brand at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's interesting that you kind of weave culture into that. HR is already serving as the guardian of so much private information and sensitive data that it just makes sense that they would be part of protecting it online as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. And again, when you drive that level of accountability and the level of importance, I do think it also helps from an engagement perspective because people really feel part of being the of being those protectors, if you will. And when you drive that through your culture, people will operate in that way, right? They tend to rise to the level of responsibility and accountability that you instill in them.
Hmm.
So it has to start within all of your HR practices to remind people and to educate people on that importance.
Yeah, that makes sense. If you can have all the high tech systems in place, but if somebody leaves a virtual door open, it's all over. How can I engage employees on the role that they can play in keeping the company and their own data safe?
So I would say it starts with your onboarding process. So, however, you're bringing people into the organization, it should start with, again, day one, explaining the level of importance and the accountability, explaining what their role is in
Hmm.
protecting the data, and then also having that ongoing partnership with the different departments who are also deployed with that same level of accountability. So,
Hmm.
having your senior executives aligned with what your risk framework is and having them modeling that right behavior. So, if you're telling people the simplest thing of don't have such simple passwords, don't give your password out, but then your executive team is giving out their passwords to maybe their assistants, that's not modeling the right
Hmm.
behavior. So you have to
Hmm.
start with where can you really model the right behavior and then train and then remind people. It can't just be a one and done. It has to be woven into every interaction that you have where you have the opportunity to remind people, hey, remember, this is something that we really take seriously and we expect you to take this responsibility and accountability to the most serious level.
Mhm. All right, Marcy, we're going to take a quick sponsorship break right now. When we return, I want to talk with you about how HR professionals can start that process of integrating cybersecurity into their culture. So stay with us.
When you're ready to get serious about positive employee relations, get connected to an entire network of experienced professionals with membership in Q. From twice-a-year conferences to local and regional events, the connections you'll make as a Q member will help you solve challenges, understand changing legislation, and leap forward as an employer of choice. You'll receive regular news updates, have access to powerful networking opportunities, and gain a support system of experienced attorneys and consultants. Learn more and request an invitation to join at QInc.com. Keep your organization up to date on the latest labor relations strategies and tactics to promote positive employee relations by becoming a member today.
We're back with Marcy Klipfel, Chief Engagement Officer at Businessolver. So, Marcy, the inspiration for this episode of Project HR came from an article that you wrote for Forbes about cybersecurity and HR. And for our listeners, we'll link to that in the show notes, so look for that. But in the article, you talked about the different ways HR can become a more integrated partner in the cybersecurity effort, and starting by engaging in a conversation with your IT department. Why is that the starting place?
At the end of the day, that department has to be at the forefront in terms of really partnering up and saying, okay, again, here's our risk framework. Here's how we approach things at the end of the day. And they are the ones who have technology at their fingertips to be able to do things like We will fish our own employees just to create that chemical
Mm.
memory. You hope that someone won't take the bait, but actually, when they do, it is a deep learning experience because it was a trial run. But if it
Mm.
would have been a real phishing email, we would be in some serious trouble. So we, for example, partner up with IT and say, how can you use our current technology to help remind people and create a chemical memory about how important it is to really be vigilant about every email or every ask that comes into your email box. So beyond having that partnership so that you can convey to customers what your SOC 1, SOC 2, for example, compliance might look like, you also need them to help from the practical application of how are we going to instill in employees how important being, again, serious about your data is. So you
Mhm.
have to engage with them because at the end of the day, that's where the true partnership and employees will see, okay, engagement or HR in this case with IT,
Mhm.
they are working together to make sure that this is paramount to the organization. So it's a strategy play as well as a branding to get it into your culture.
Excellent. Yeah, I wouldn't have thought about it that way. So tell me, how can our HR team and IT work together to create sort of an emergency response plan? You talked about, phishing your own employees. How do you respond to that?
So I would say in every facet of where you are already recertifying your employees, for example, so at Businessolver, all of our employees are recertified every year on workplace conduct, which also has a security HIPAA related items with it. And so that's where we really partner up together and say, what is current out there? What is the most current form that hackers are now displaying to penetrate into your organization, and how can we keep that training fresh so that it stays top of mind with what's actually currently going on. So I would say you have to go and look in all of your training applications to say, where can we weave this in
Mm.
so that it just becomes part of normal course of business, but it stays fresh and current, if that makes sense.
So let's just say I've had this conversation with IT. What's the next step?
So the next step is to really brand it and figure out how do you make this a campaign, if you will, but not just June is cybersecurity month or anything like that. It's a
Mm.
campaign that lives on so that it's a chemical memory. So for us, we weave it into every training on our system. So as we're training our our architects, for example, who are going into our system on a regular basis, we use that opportunity to remind people, remember how important it is to keep top of mind that you have this access, which brings responsibility, which brings accountability. So I know I sound like a broken record, but that's how you become, it's a habit.
Hmm.
And you don't have to worry about people forgetting because it was just a flash in the pan campaign. It becomes woven into everything when they touch your system.
Hmm. So you talked about, making this part of your onboarding process, but what about my existing employees? When should this training start?
If you haven't started it, I would start it right away. I would get it again. Think about where you're already training, like leadership training,
Mm.
and weave it into your leadership training as remember, this is a critical component of being a leader is ensuring that we protect our most sensitive information.
Hmm.
And so as you model that behavior, as you think about how to make this part of the conversation, just look at every way that you're touching employees and weave it in. A great opportunity could be if there are listeners out there that are trying to get this started. Think about the next time you will have, for example, your open enrollment for your benefits
Hmm.
and weave something into that process because you already are going through that process.
Hmm.
So use it as a way to say, just as we take your employee data so seriously and we protect it, we want to remind you that you also are part of making sure that our data stays protected.
So how do I know if this message is getting through? So we've woven it into our training. We're underway. How can we measure? How do we know?
Well, I've used the one example of we fish our own employees, which sounds kind of mean and a little bit twisted, but we are regularly looking at how many are quote unquote taking the bait
Hmm.
and using that as a sample to say, okay, are our messages really resonating? Are enough people being thoughtful and scrutinizing the emails? And you've sort of passed that, in my opinion, you've sort of passed that test when you actually have people flagging emails that aren't even intentional phishing emails.
Yeah.
So that's been another place for us that we have to think about. How do you make sure that the emails you actually need people paying attention to are
Right.
not identified as phishing? But that's been I would rather have that problem. So, for example, if we send something out from our engagement, which HR inbox, we will get a certain percentage of employees saying, I just want to make sure this is really an
Right.
email that I should pay attention to.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we know that that's really taken hold in our culture, which we really appreciate.
Marcy, we're going to take some time out for another quick break. We'll be right back after this. You're listening to the Project HR podcast. I'm your host, Jennifer Oraqua, and our guest today is Marcy Klipfel, the Chief Engagement Officer at Businessolver. And we are back. So, Marcy, let's talk about HRIS and other HR software. Is it safe to assume that a third-party HR software is secure?
So it is best to come from the standpoint that you assume it is not secure and you have the vendor partner prove you differently. So I always say start with the RFP
Mm.
where you make it very clear how serious cybersecurity is to you and your organization, and make sure that when you're looking at a third party software to bring into your organization, that they need to prove to you that it is secure. And there's very basic things to very in-depth things that obviously a cybersecurity or an IT professional can partner with you on.
Mhm.
But the very basic is, do they even have cyber insurance? Is it even on their radar that if something were to happen, that they have a plan in place? I mean, that's where, again, you can start very basic and build, but it's really important to engage your IT experts to help you as
Mhm.
you scrutinize bringing in HR software, any software really, but in particular, sometimes I think there is maybe a level of comfort. Oh, it's HR software. It must be secure.
Mhm.
And you really should start from a place that it's not and have them prove to you that it is.
So, if I don't have a tech background, how can I assess that security and safety of my software?
Well, one thing that I would offer up to our listeners is we actually have some webinars on creating really great RFPs and asking those questions. So,
Mm.
Businessolver, if you go to our website, you can find some of those blogs and webinars on RFPs. I also think just asking for guidance from some sort of oversight. You might have like a technology committee if you don't have access to exactly that type of expertise.
Mhm.
You probably are able to leverage something that would help you get a format to ask those questions. I
Mhm.
would also say you should ask the potential vendor and say,
Mhm.
what are your best practices in terms of what an RFP should look like? And they may have things that you can leverage.
So, what about things I already have in place? Like, I'm thinking I have a number of HR friends who, like, I wouldn't call them technophobes, but they're more on the people side of things. Do you have any advice for HR professionals who might be nervous about delving into this aspect of the work? I love the idea you said about forming a technology committee. Any other ideas there?
I would say, the great thing about HR professionals is we all want to help each other, I find,
Mm.
in our just in our profession. So,
Mhm.
any sort of SHRM or local HR group, or
Mhm.
even just reaching out to me, I will offer myself out, and
Okay.
I'm lucky enough to work for a tech company,
Uh-huh.
but be in the HR space. But I would say leveraging your network and just asking for help. I think, again, just by the spirit of being in
Mm.
HR, we want to help. And so find those network groups. LinkedIn has lots of
Mhm.
groups that are for HR professionals
Mhm.
where you can put a question out there. And I'm always just so pleased about how many people respond and can
Mhm.
really give me best practice.
For sure. Yeah. So we've been referencing your work with Businessolver throughout this podcast, but we haven't really addressed your work there specifically. Can you tell our audience a little bit more about the benefits administrative systems that Businessolver offers?
Sure. So we have a technology called Benefit Solver, and it is a SaaS technology, so software as a service. And we are very innovative when it comes to how we can engage with our members. And our members are the employees of the clients that we partner with. And so, one of the things that we're really proud of is we have a benefits virtual assistant called Sophia, and she leverages artificial intelligence and can really answer employee questions when they need to be answered, not in an 8 to 5 type of way, but a more non-traditional whenever you need that answer. Because that's what we find is when people need their benefits, it's typically not during an 8 to 5
Sure.
type of
Right.
situation. So we have a lot of ways that we can engage with members and really meet them where they need to be met. So we always say right benefits at the right time. And that's what our
Mhm.
mission is to make sure that we serve clients in that way.
So does the sort of one-stop shop approach that you guys offer result in more security for your customers?
We would say unequivocally yes.
Mhm.
The less systems that you have to, bolt on, the better. But
Mhm.
in particular, your benefit system, you want an organization that is solely focused in that subject matter because it is so important that the system is secure.
Mhm.
And so I really like the space that we're in terms of we're fiercely agnostic and this is what we do. We're benefit savants.
Mm. I like that. So, tell me, where can our listeners go to learn more about Business Solver?
So, of course, businessolver.com. I would also say our marketing group puts great content out on LinkedIn. So, subscribing to our blogs, and we really get into a lot of different thought leadership,
Mhm.
not just benefits related, but certainly I would say empathy is one area that we've got a lot of good data and years of it,
Okay.
and it's really helping, I think, driving with our clients and listeners out there in terms of, especially right now as we're navigating the world in a way that I think HR has never been
Sure.
challenged or stretched this much.
Yeah, for sure.
We have a lot of great content and thought leadership around how can we help think about things and bring an empathetic viewpoint, and because we believe it's really about the reverse golden rule. So I really need to be thinking about not how to do unto others, how would they want this to be delivered? So that's really how we believe in
Hmm.
the reverse golden rule,
Hmm.
thinking about it from that person's seat and putting myself in that person's shoes. And I think sometimes that can be hard to convey, especially to maybe different executives who aren't so focused on the people side. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of good content there about how to bring along the other executives on your team so
Mm.
that you really can emerge as a very empathetic organization, because we believe that's what employees ultimately are looking for.
That's great stuff. So, links to the Business Solver website and to Marcy's Forbes article on cybersecurity will be included in this episode's companion guide. So, be sure to unlock that today at projectionsinc.com/podcast. Right now, though, Marcy, it is time for our lightning round questions. These are questions we ask of every guest of the podcast. Are you ready?
Yes.
All right. So, our first question is always a topic showdown. In this episode, we've been talking about cybersecurity. And as we all know, password hygiene is an important component of online security. So, with that in mind, and in your opinion, Marcy, which of these world's worst passwords is actually worse? 123456 or password?
I would say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And the reason I say that, I had to chuckle. So my daughter dances and I can get into anything password wise because she does 5, 6, 7, 8 like a dancer. 5, 6, 7, 8.
Yep.
So I had to chuckle because I can break into any of her stuff, and then it reminded me of the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. To me, that is just the world's absolute worst
Yep. I would agree.
password.
I would definitely agree.
Do.
Yep. All right, Marcy, what's the best book you've read recently?
So, and I was really thinking about this because I do a lot of free reading, but I will say the one that's really sticking with me right now, and I read it just a couple months ago, but it's really guided us in our diversity, equality, and inclusion efforts, is The Subtle Acts of Exclusion by Tiffany Janet and Michael Barron. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but I would say it is an absolute must read. It's really helped me come from a place of calling in, as we have this, cancel culture and some things that are happening where it's very easy right now to say, if you don't believe what I believe, I'm calling you out. This book really frames things in a whole host of ways about how do you call people in right now and work. Again, I would tie it to empathy, but work on understanding from where people are coming from.
That sounds excellent. I will definitely pick that up. All right. So, what's your favorite thing about working in benefits tech?
So I absolutely love our product. I used to work for a consulting company and I had never heard of Businessolver. And so I always think about the companies I could have helped, knowing about how amazing our technology is. I will say benefits tech, though, very personally for me, because I represent the buyer, I feel very connected to the mission of our organization on a whole bunch of levels. So it just creates complete and total engagement for me. I'm not saying I do backflips into work every day, but I absolutely love what we do and who we do it with and the clients that we connect with.
Yeah, and I love that. And that kind of passion is what really creates success. So I love hearing that. So tell me, what's the best piece of advice you've ever been given?
So I've always stuck with this advice, and in the current culture, I always feel like I have to explain a little bit because it doesn't have the same ring to it that it did back when I started. But right out of college, I worked for a consulting firm, and I was really lobbying for something to change, and I kind of gave up because a principal at the firm told me no. And my mentor, who's still my mentor at this time, said, no is just another opportunity to get a yes. And so I will qualify that now, being, 20 plus years later, in framing it, right? So in a business setting, in a setting where you have a goal, in a setting where you know in your heart of hearts that you can give more and do more, if someone is blocking, right, find another way to reframe. Because you can always find a way, in my opinion, to make something better than what it was. And just taking no on the face, to me, leaves a lot on the table of what people can do from a potential standpoint. So no is just another opportunity to get a yes.
Interesting. And I think that kind of dovetails with what you were saying a minute ago about calling people in instead of calling them out.
Absolutely.
So finally, who or what inspires you?
So I found, especially with all of the environmental, societal things going on right now, I have really tried to find inspiration in the little things. And so I was trying to think, through how do I really wow them with inspiration. But I would say right now, currently what's inspiring me is Simone Biles.
Oh, yeah.
And just if you think about putting yourself in her shoes and everything that she has endured, and the grace to and the fortitude to be able to step back, let her team step forward, and everything great that's happened for that team individually and also as a team. And then she came back for herself.
Right.
I find that extremely inspirational, and it's just such a shift for, I think, what we experienced with, in particular, gymnasts before her, right? Where it was, get up and do that vault even though you're injured, and it doesn't even matter to your score. Like, that's just what you do. You push through and you put yourself at risk mentally and physically. And I think she's just really become an inspiration about turning that tide. Yeah. And I think it's going to serve gymnastics and, sports in general into the future to show that kind of courage.
Yeah, that's a great thought. I love that. All right. Marcy, thanks so much for joining me today on this week's episode of Project HR.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was such a great conversation. I appreciate it.
And I want to thank our listeners too. Once again, this is your reminder to grab the companion guide for this episode at projectionsinc.com/podcast. If you'd like to be on Project HR, or you know someone who would, feel free to email us at projecthr@projectionsinc.com. I want to take one final opportunity to thank our episode sponsor, Q. Remember to check out the benefits of a Q membership and conference attendance, both virtual and in person, at qinc.com. Q provides the resources you need to elevate your positive employee relations strategy. And last, but certainly not least, to make sure you never miss an episode of Project HR, we hope you'll subscribe to the podcast. Drop us a line, leave us a review, or give us a handful of stars wherever you get your content. That's it for me for now. Let's make it a great day at work.